Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today, I'm going to dive into the opposite of what is popular within media, on social media, it seems, within society, which is all these other people are saying, hey, it's patriotic to pay tax. People should pay more tax. The world would be better if just people paid tax. Hey, people are in hardship. You should pay tax. And I'm going to give you the case against paying tax, all right? So before we dive into that, if you are interested in any sort of help with these types of things, with optimizing your tax internationally, legally, domestically, etc., if you're interested in company formations, international or offshore banking, if you're interested in moving abroad, getting residencies, citizenships, etc., you can book a call with me. There's a link below, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. And please, if you enjoy our videos, click the subscribe button, click the like button, share it with your friends, click the notification bell, all those types of things. Let's jump into it. All right, so if you just go onto, I don't know, Twitter, Facebook, if you read news articles, etc., what are you going to see where the subject of tax comes up? Well, let's just kind of run through a couple recent news articles. There was Trump's tax returns were released not too long ago. John McAfee got arrested in Spain for tax evasion. And there was a recent one with Shakira is under a big tax case related to the Spanish government and not paying tax. Now, let me clarify here. What am I going to be suggesting in this video? I'm not at all going to suggest, hey, evade tax and illegally don't pay tax. Okay, that's not the conversation that I'm going to have. What I'm going to make is the case that you should absolutely do your utmost to legally minimize your tax as much as possible. So, the difference between John McAfee, who is, just evading tax, and Donald Trump, who is maximizing write-offs and deductions and things like this, is a big difference, right? If you can get away, if you can structure your affairs in such a way that you pay little to no tax, I'm going to argue with you that that is absolutely what you should do, okay? It is by far what every single person in most of the world, and I'll give like a couple exceptions, but for the most part, you should be doing that, right? This other thing over here, where you're evading taxes, like Shakira, like John McAfee, is quite frankly stupid, okay? You shouldn't be doing that. The consequences are, hey, listen, you can go to prison, you can, it's not good, right? So you don't want to be in this camp. What I'm not going to be suggesting is, hey, just tell the government, screw you guys, I'm not paying tax. No. What I'm going to say is, as much as possible, the best thing that you can do, the most ethical, the most patriotic, the most whatever, is to reduce the amount of tax you can as much as legally possible, all right? So how do I make that argument? Well, let's kind of go and look at the counter-argument first. What is the counter-argument that you see today? So first of all, there's this idea of people paying their quote-unquote fair share, right? So we could use Donald Trump as an example, and we could say, hey, listen, what's the deal with Donald Trump? Donald Trump supposedly paid, $750 a year in tax for a couple of years. Over the course of 15 years, he paid no tax in 10 of those years, etc., right? And you can sit there and you can kind of look at this and you can say, all right, well, clearly the guy lived a very lavish lifestyle, right? I mean, he's flying around in private jets. He has his Mar-a-Lago estate, which is just opulent. He's got his, penthouse in downtown New York. He's, doing whatever else. Somebody who is living this kind of lifestyle, they should be paying a lot of tax, right? That would be, the one argument. Then you go and you say, okay, well, that's one part of it. The next part of it is, hang on, there's a lot of people who are in need, right? I mean, look, there's a homelessness problem in a bunch of places. Some people don't have enough in terms of their medical, right? They don't have very good education. There's underfunded schools. There's underfunded hospitals. The infrastructure is collapsing, et cetera, right? So clearly, this should be a case that if you actually care about people, if you care about the country you live in, you care about the world, you would want to pay more tax, or you should be paying more tax in order to better everything, right? No. I'm going to tell you that that is, in most cases, total nonsense. All right, so let's deconstruct this a little bit, all right? And I'm going to kind of break this argument down into, let's see here, I would say three major parts, three to four major parts of what we're going to discuss. So let's start with the idea that, which is I think the most suspect, right? Which is, hey, listen, people don't have because you're not paying tax. Now, in most what I would call developed countries, this is untrue, all right? It is more true if you were, say, in Montenegro, okay, then this would be more true. If you were in, I don't know, maybe if you're in like Belize or something like that, it'd be more true. If you're in UAE, it might be more true. Why is that? They have their own currency, okay? So where you're in a country, or sorry, they don't have their own currency. So here's the thing, right? If you're in a country like the US, how much does your taxes have to do with what they spend on education, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on the military, on whatever else? Zero. It has zero to do with it. And I can demonstrate that to you by the fact that there's over a $20 trillion debt, okay? So clearly they're not budget constrained. Clearly their decision to spend money has nothing to do with how much money comes in. They sit there and they say, oh, we didn't have enough money to come in, but we decided that, hey, listen, we want these things anyway, so we're going to spend. And probably in this year alone, and we're sitting here in 2020, the debt or the deficit will probably be close to $10 trillion by the time all is said and done. That would be like at least 5 trillion, but probably more. I think we're way over 5 trillion already. Probably close to $10 trillion. Okay, so. Now, I think there's just like a fundamental breakdown in the logic of somebody who's arguing that, hey, listen, your lack of taxes paid are preventing people's lives from being good. Because it would be one thing if they were sitting there saying, oh, sorry, we can't do that because we don't have the budget. But they're not saying that. They're saying, hey, we don't have the budget and we're going to pay for it anyway. Now, the difference if you're in Montenegro is that they actually, so they're on the euro. Right? So they have to get euros from somewhere. So where are they going to get the euros to spend? They can borrow them from, say, the IMF, et cetera, if they get that loan, and that's going to be a problem for them. Or they can turn around and they can collect that through some form of revenue, some form of taxation, right? So if we go to UAE, they have a currency that's pegged to the dollar. If you go to Hong Kong, they have a currency that's pegged to the dollar. A variety of these places have currencies that are pegged to the dollar. So I would say if you don't have your own currency, or if your currency is pegged to some other currency, then your ability to simply print money is not there. And therefore, you're reliant on external debt, or you are reliant on tax revenue. So in those cases, I think you can make a fair argument that it's like, okay, yeah, there's a budgetary constraint. But if you're in UK, if you're in Canada, if you're in Australia, if you're in New Zealand, if you're in Japan, if you're in the US, if you're in most of Europe, arguably, or at least certainly the EU, I would say Switzerland, I would say Norway, all these places, is what's going on constrained really by taxes? No, it's a lie. It's a myth. It is not. You can see it in the debt, in the way that they take it on. And you can say, oh, hey, well, but that's a bad thing, et cetera. We can get into a whole other conversation at some point in time about, how national debts work when it's denominated in their own currency and they can print money and things like this. The bottom line is that it simply is inaccurate to say that the government is not spending because you're not paying taxes or because anyone is not paying taxes, because we can see the evidence behaviorally is that or the government is spending. Like, behaviors don't lie, okay? Results don't lie. That's the way that it goes. So that argument breaks down. Let's talk about the second one, which is, hey, listen, you should be contributing your fair share, and this is what's going on here. Well, I think I have a gross problem. So this is where I think that the argument for paying taxes in a country like Singapore are great. Okay, let's look at the numbers and compare the U.S. to Singapore as a simple example. So the U.S. spends about 18% of GDP on healthcare. Okay, their medical outcomes are not even close to the best in the world, but that is the highest share of GDP in the world spent on healthcare. Now, the one country that maybe is kind of comparable in terms of like raw per person spending is like Norway, right? Because Norway's GDP is higher and they're spending about 14% of GDP on healthcare. Most countries, so we can look at places like Canada, like France, like UK, etc. They're spending closer to 10%, slightly over 10% of GDP on healthcare. They're achieving better medical outcomes, right? and their GDP per capita is lower. So the raw spending per person is is less than half in a lot of cases. Like for almost all the world, the spending per person is less than half, okay? And the medical outcomes are better. Now, you might say, okay, well, that's a case for spending, the efficiency of the spending in the US or in Canada, in Australia and UK and places like this. I mean, it beats the US, but I think it's still pretty bad. Let's go over to Singapore. Okay, Singapore is a great contrasted example. Singapore has a private healthcare system. It's a regulated private healthcare system, but a private healthcare system, so you can contrast it with the US. Do you know what Singapore spends on healthcare? 4% of GDP, and they have world-class medical outcomes. Okay, so 4% of GDP, they're getting this result. These guys are here. What is the most basic rule of management? The most basic rule of management is move resources from where they are not being used well to where they are being used well. Okay, optimize the utilization of resources. What gets rewarded gets repeated. Okay, so when a country is using your money very poorly, the problem is not revenue. The problem is efficiency, okay? When somebody is wasting your money, imagine you're like talking about somebody who's a spending addict, right? They're just irresponsible in terms of their financial behaviors. The problem with that person is not that they need more money, right? We can look at an extreme example. Joe Lowe in the 1MDB scandal spent like $82 million partying in 6 months. One night he spent something like $2 million in Saint-Tropez on bottles of Cristal, okay? So if that guy's broke, which, I mean, in spite of stealing billions of dollars from the Malaysian people, he ended up basically broke, right? Was continually getting himself down to the point where he had no money. Did that guy have a revenue problem? No, that guy had a spending problem. Well, the problem with most of these Western governments is that they don't have a revenue problem, they have a spending problem. And you do not solve that problem by giving them more money to spend. You solve it by saying, hey, listen, get your ass out of your, what are you doing? What are you doing? Solve this underlying problem. Be more efficient. We know for a fact, right? I'll use the US as the kind of extreme example. It is absolutely, you cannot tell me that every single other developed nation on the planet is able to spend half what you are spending on healthcare and get equivalent or superior medical outcomes, and you can't do the same. That is an untenable argument. In theory, if you're saying, oh, we're more advanced, we have better technology, we have all this, great, then you should be able to deliver superior medical outcomes for less cost. That should be the reality. And some people will say, oh, but the research comes out of, the research should be amortized the same. Drugs that cost an identical drug, okay, between, say, the US and Canada will often cost 5 times more in the US, okay? This is not a question of budget. This is a question of how the money is being used. And by the way, we can go through a lot of different other things. We can look at health or at education, right? K-12 education. The US ranks, I think, is 3rd or 4th in the world for spending per student, right? And their health or their education outcomes way down. Again, we can go and look at Singapore. We can see that they're top in the world in terms of their educational outcomes, and they're spending dramatically lower per person. Okay. You can go and can look at criminal justice. The US is the least safe, okay? The least safe developed country in the world, okay? The highest murders per capita, all right? And yet it has the highest incarceration rates, okay? So you're spending enormous amounts, far more than other countries, and you're getting worse outcomes. Is that a, hey, listen, we need to be safer, so we need to be spending more money? Really? You're already spending a heck of a lot of money and you're not getting the outcomes. The problem is efficiency of using capital, not the amount of capital that you have. And to feed that machine by continuing to perpetuate it, giving more and more money, is insanity. It is pure and utter insanity. And if you care, if you're a patriot, if you're somebody who cares about ethics and allocation of resources and doing the best that you can, you feeding that machine, that monster, is not a good use of resources. So now you might say, okay, great, Michael, you're arguing against the US. And by the way, we can go through, we can look at infrastructure. California announced the most expensive ever high-speed rail from San Francisco to LA. Unbelievable, most expensive per kilometer. And it's one of the slowest in the world, okay? This was what prompted Elon Musk, by the way, to come up with Hyperloop and go on and out. Like, it was just like, hey, listen, you should be able to do this at 1/10 the budget and deliver a far superior thing. Should you contribute to that? I mean, there's a reason. I did a video recently about communist California, the nonsense that's going on there, the deplorable mismanagement that is happening, okay? Like, you have to at some point say, this is unacceptable. This is not okay. We will not give more to this system, okay? And so you might say, okay, great. Well, Michael, that's wonderful. You're making a case that the U.S. certainly mismanages money. California within the U.S. is tremendously bad, et cetera. Okay, great. But what about some other places? I mean, you can go and you can look at the other places. This is why, there's a little bit of a different thing. So from the standpoint of Singapore, let's talk about Singapore, okay? Singapore, the highest marginal tax rate is 22%. If you're operating through a company, they have a single imputation system, which means that the company can pay a maximum of 17% tax, and then you don't pay tax on dividends. So realistically, your tax rate is 17%. Okay? For that, you have one of the safest countries in the world. The only other country that is comparable safety is Japan. Japan's a miracle. It's unbelievable that, with 120 million people, you can have murder rates that are that low, et cetera. So you have an extremely safe country. Great. They do an awesome job. It's extremely clean. They do an awesome job. Their education is fantastic. They do an awesome job. Their healthcare is fantastic. They do an awesome job. Okay, there's a lot of opportunities. Their people do well, et cetera, et cetera. To pay that rate of tax, I think is perfectly reasonable. If you're in Singapore, you should probably be paying your tax. Probably makes perfectly good sense, okay? That is yeah, you're contributing. If you want to go over to Germany, all right? Germany, I can get a chart. I put it on Twitter recently. If you want to go and check out at Michael Rosmer, you can follow me on Twitter. I had some posts showing if you make 100,000 euros or 200,000 euros, what is it that the actual cost is for the employer and how much do you actually take home? The spread for Germany is decent, right? The healthcare system in Germany is very good. I would argue the education is very good. Its costs are quite low for people, et cetera. You can start to make an argument that you're okay, great, German taxes are high, but, things work pretty well in Germany. You can make a case-by-case study of that, right? I think that if you're in Spain, the argument is much harder to make. If you're in Italy, the argument is much harder to make. If you're in Sweden, the argument to make is, fairly decent. I think that in Sweden, I think that probably taxes could be reduced by 20% or so, right? Because the highest marginal tax rate is around 56%, right? So you can certainly go down there. If you're in Norway, look, Norway has one of the lowest debts in the world. Their assets actually exceed their debts. They have the largest sovereign wealth fund. They manage things very well. They do overspend. Most expensive education per person, one of the probably most expensive healthcare per person. So Norway's a super expensive country. If you've been to Oslo, it's nuts. Just unbelievable what you'll pay for taxis, 3 times as expensive as London. Okay, so there are some things, but some of the highest incomes in the world, things like work, you could make an argument, right? You could be okay, you kind of getting what you pay for. Taxes are not that insane in Norway. They're better than they are, say, in Sweden. Denmark, Belgium, I think are harder to argue. Things are much worse there, in spite of what some people may want to tell you. If you're in Eastern Europe, I'm sitting here in Bulgaria right now. Look, Bulgaria, the tax rate, depending on how you're absorbing your income, is between 5 and 14.5%. If you're in that range, then, okay, things aren't that good, but your taxes are also really low, right? Okay, so you can kind of balance this out. So you can make an argument for different places. I fundamentally look at it as I think that government in most parts of the world is very inefficient. Again, I just compare to Singapore for healthcare, right? You can say, okay, great. Norway is spending 14% of GDP on healthcare. Places like Canada, et cetera, it's around 12%, something like that. France, and so on and so forth. I'm well, hang on, why are they not spending 4 like Singapore? I would like to know that. Why are they not spending 4 like Singapore? I feel like that should be an attainable objective. So I think there's a lot of room to improve, and I think that giving more money to the tax is not helpful. So let me give the contrasting, the other side of this, which is I think really important to understand, okay? What happens with that money if you don't pay the tax? Let's use Bill Gates as an example. Let's use Elon Musk as an example, okay? Let's use Mark Zuckerberg as an example. So you don't pay that tax. What do you now do? Does that mean that you're not contributing to the good of society? No, not at all. You could actually, arguably, I think that Bill Gates spends his money far, far, far better than the government spends his money. I'd much rather that Bill Gates has his own money. Look at what he's doing in terms of investments into things like alternative energy, right? Developing nuclear when nobody is developing nuclear and should be, right? Safe nuclear, et cetera, pushing for that. Developing new types of toilets, developing all different things in terms of like working on education. Now, actually, the education outcomes aren't very good. So, you know, in that his spending has been very ineffective, right? He would tell you that. You know, malaria deaths way down because of Bill Gates, etc. So, you know, I can at least see what he's getting for his money. So let's just kind of like put these first 2 points in context here. Let's say you're Bill Gates. You're like, hang on a minute. If I pay more taxes, the government will not change what they spend, okay? But I will have more money that I can in turn go and use more efficiently. This seems like the most ethical, patriotic thing that you can possibly do to me. I mean, would I give money to a place that is not going to change the outcomes, and that if I give it, it's going to result in more waste? Or am I going to take those same resources and deploy them in a way that's more effective? I think that if you're not arguing kind of ethics from the standpoint of stewardship, then you're probably missing the point. And the best stewardship is to utilize those resources as optimized as possible. I want Bill Gates to pay zero tax. Okay, supposedly he's paid like $10 billion in tax. I want him to pay zero tax. Why? Because I would much rather him spend the money than the government spend the money. I think he can do far, far better with it. Okay, we're talking about income tax here. There's other taxes, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So this is, I think, a big thing. If you're in a lot of these countries, in kind of like the former Soviet Union, etc., it's super corrupt, right? People are robbing the country. So like, what's the case against paying taxes in Serbia? Well, you know, they put up a Christmas tree that was more expensive than the one in Rockefeller Center in New York, okay? Did it really cost that? No. This is a way that they rob the people. You have similar things, some statues that were paid for in Bucharest, in Romania, right? Ways that they rob the people. They go and they have these highway contracts that get done where it's EU money, and you know the highways are breaking 5 years later because of the fact that basically they gave the money out, paid for the minimum quality materials, and pocketed a whole bunch of money for themselves. You know, if you're in countries like this, why would you pay taxes? If you have a corrupt government, that's where the money's going. You're far better off. Like, the moral thing for you to do is to take the money and deploy it better yourself. By the way, you putting like skin in the game and getting down and like trying to figure out the problems, solve them, like being in the trenches. This is, you know, you can look at the Priscilla Chan or whatever the Chan Zuckerberg Institute, Priscilla Chan, right? Mark Zuckerberg's wife. Like, here's a woman who is in the trenches herself, learning very specifically. You know, she starts a school, she goes and she invests herself in the actual problems of the students, and spends her own money to try and improve the outcomes and try and figure out ways of scaling that up. Fantastic. Like, I would much rather that. It's one of the reasons why, I think it was Larry Page said, rather than donate his money to charity, he would give it to Elon Musk, right? Look, like, what has Elon Musk done for the world in the last 20 years compared to what the government has done? Imagine if Elon Musk had like about $200 million at the time he exited PayPal, right? So you're like, okay, great. Imagine he'd taken that $200 million, he'd paid 100% tax, he'd given it all to the government. He's like, hey, look, I'm going to be the patriotic guy. Where would the world be today? You would probably not have electric cars, certainly not so good. Battery technology wouldn't be advanced, certainly not so much. Solar deployment probably would be reduced, although that one's a little bit more iffy. The advancements in rocketry and the et cetera would be way behind. Okay? To give you some idea of the innovation and the advancement purported by, or put forward by, say, SpaceX. Originally, until SpaceX came along, the contractors were Lockheed Martin and Boeing, which worked together in this alliance. Okay? Before they figured out how to launch, land, and reuse rockets, if you used SpaceX, the cost was so much cheaper that the satellite was free. Okay? So imagine what this does in terms of saving on defense budgets, in terms of saving on NASA's budgets, on terms of on and on and on and on. Okay? Like, I would just far, far rather people like that keep their money and deploy it. And I would encourage everybody. Look, the argument, when I make the argument for not paying taxes, okay, I'm not saying, hey, great, go and spend the money on bottle service at some club like Joe Low. I think that's frivolous and stupid, okay? Don't do that. I think, great, deploy your money in ways that is useful, that is good. That's like, it's just, I think, so self-evident. It's unbelievable to me that somebody would not have that awareness. So how do you do that? We do it primarily through innovation, through building infrastructure, et cetera. but whatever way it is that you can. So far be it, Bill Gates made this point a number of years ago, and I thought it was a very good point, was he's like, hey, listen, you have to separate between net worth and consumption. Okay, there's a difference between saying, hey, listen, I have $100 billion that I'm consuming on frivolous things. Now, to be fair, that does get recycled into people's wages and so on and so forth, right? But that's one thing. Okay, great, tax that in one way. But when you're taking your money and you're using it to advance technology, to build infrastructure, to bring efficiencies into the system that people benefit from, like imagine what Google has done for you, okay? Think about life in the year 2000. No Google Maps, no Google in general, no YouTube, no Gmail, et cetera, et cetera. Like this is a service that is free, okay? Just your ability to navigate, just Google Maps, a free service, adds so much value to the lives of billions of people, like literally billions of people, that it's very difficult to quantify. Like, what has the government done in an equivalent period of time that has had such a profound impact? If you think about education, okay, the government blows enormous amounts of money on education, enormous. Okay, the US leads in terms of their waste, but most countries around the world are very wasteful in terms of their education spending. You know what the number one thing is that has revolutionized, arguably, education? YouTube. Being able to have free videos. Like literally you can sit here and you can learn almost anything online for free on YouTube. Come on. Like who has done, like where is the government? Why was the government not leading that? You want to talk to me about, hey, listen, government spending taxes and benefit, etc. You would have been far better off to go and invent YouTube. That would have done far, far, far more good than giving the money to the government, which would have blown it on the same bullshit year after year after year for decades. Okay? The advancements that they have made in the last, 50, 70, maybe even 100 years are negligible, if any. You may even argue that in some respects there are worse outcomes, at least culturally. Okay? I don't think that's quite true. I think that there have been some advances, but certainly the advances are at best highly incremental. Okay? So don't fuel that stuff. That's a bunch of nonsense. Okay? This brings us to our third point. If you do not pay income tax, does it mean that you're not contributing? No, of course not. And I'm talking about in terms of taxes. There are still consumption taxes, right? So it's very hard to get around things like VAT, sales tax. Maybe you're going to work on minimizing those to some extent, but the reality is that if you're a high income earner and you're consuming, right, you're paying those. That's, part of what's going on. Fair enough. You're paying property taxes, right? You're paying vice taxes. If you're driving through Spain on the highway, you're paying highway tolls. If you're in France, you're paying highway tolls, etc. Right? There's taxes on fuel. There's taxes on all these different things. So to say that you're not contributing at all, you can go back to the example of Donald Trump, right? There's payroll taxes, right? There's state taxes, etc., etc., etc. So I think that if you are in the majority of cases, and again, I think that if you're in Singapore to me is kind of like the holy grail of their efficiency is good, their outcomes are good, okay? I'm not going to complain about Singapore. I think if you're in Singapore, you should probably pay your full tax and be happy that you live in a country that does a great job with it, okay? If you're in Dubai, you don't pay any tax, well, there's VAT now, 5%, but you should probably be happy, hey, listen, they're delivering some pretty good outcomes for a very low cost. Okay, fair enough. If you're in the US, if you're in Canada, if you're in Australia, if you're in most of the Western world, I think your tax dollars are being poorly spent. You can do better and you should do better with your own money than the government does. And anyone who sits there telling you that you should be paying more tax and the world is not good because of you, is wrong. It's not the thing that you should do. So I'm going to encourage you to invest in if there are rules that are optimized that allow you to pay less tax, do what everybody else is doing anyway, and don't feel guilty about it. Be proud of it, that you're not contributing to the machine of waste that is out there. That is what I would say. There's this expression, some people say taxation is theft. I don't think taxation is theft. I think taxation is waste. And it is poor stewardship to waste your resources. So anyway, that's my perspective. If you have a different perspective, by all means, share it in the comments below. Let me know what you think. If you liked this video, click like. If you don't, tell me what it is that you don't like about it. Would love to hear from you. If you have some other topic that you'd like us to cover, mention it below. Please subscribe to our channel. Click the subscribe button. Click the notification bell. And if you want any assistance with international structuring, with tax planning, with banking, with relocating abroad to someplace that maybe you feel like people are, it's more to inclined with what it is that you like, what your values are, etc., then reach out to us as well. We can help you with residencies, citizenships, etc. There's a link below that you can click clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. You can book a call with me, or offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. I will see you guys on the next video.